Hello, this is Roger Royce with the 10,000 Startups podcast. I'm a partner with Haynes Boone in Palo Alto. I do emerging growth and venture capital. And today I'd like to talk a little bit about an M&A structure that you're very likely to see if you're a startup entrepreneur and you're about to sell your company. Now, we could spend hours talking about M&A issues, and I have done so on this podcast. You can find that content. I'm going to kind of zero in on one particular type of transaction today, however. That's the reverse subsidiary merger, or also called the reverse triangular merger. And the reason why is because if you are about to sell your company in a tax-free transaction, a stock for stock tax-free deal, that's likely how it's going to go. And I want to tell you what it is and why it is likely to be that structure. So let me share my screen. So as you can see, typical merger, we have an acquiring company. We've got that's the buyer. We've got the target. That's your startup, I guess, and the shareholders, the owners of that target corporation. And in a typical merger, it's pretty easy to do as a corporate and a tax law matter. It's basically a combination of any two corporations and one survives. There are other types of combinations that we never ever see. There's consolidations where a new company arises, but pretty much this is the way companies get acquired by merger. Now, what you'll notice about this, I'm going to ignore all of this tax language on this slide and kind of focus on the corporate issue. What you notice about this is that there's no gain, except to the extent there's some cash in the deal, but there's no gain to the shareholders of the target. And the acquirer, they basically succeed, they call it corporate succession, to all of the assets and the business and the liabilities of the target, known or unknown. They step into its shoes. Now, as you can imagine, an acquirer might be saying, we've got lots of good due diligence and we've got good reps and warranties, but, we don't know for sure what the heck is going on with that company. And if there's some contingent or unknown liability that's going to pop up and we're going to get stuck with. So, not so sure we want to step into the shoes of an unknown unknown. So, that's why there is such a thing as a triangular merger. And in a triangular merger, the acquirer forms a merger sub, a 100% owned subsidiary, and that sub merges with the target. So when the smoke clears, you have acquiring company owns a subsidiary that has the business of target and the liabilities. And the liability exposure will stop at the sub, and the acquirer won't get dinged for the liabilities, the unknown liabilities of the target. Now, as a tax matter, there's two ways, as a corporate matter as well, there's two ways this could happen. Could be a forward merger, in which case the merger sub is a survivor. Because remember what I said, in a merger, one company survives and one goes out of existence, or a reverse subsidiary merger, where the target survives, which looks an awful lot like a sale of stock, right? And as you might expect, because of that, the reverse subsidiary merger is by far the more popular one, because it is just like a sale of stock. Now, let me kind of walk through that. That's the reverse triangular merger. So again, let me just say the structure again. So target shareholders, they own the shares of target, acquirer forms a merger sub. The merger sub merges with and into target, with target surviving. And in that transaction, the shareholders are going to receive acquirer stock in exchange for their target stock. Now, there's no gain or loss to anybody, except to the extent there's boot, which is typically cash. Could be other types of property, but typically we mean cash. And then there's going to be complete succession of tax attributes all the way around. Now, there are a couple of tax requirements that are worth noting. And one is that the target shareholders have to surrender control. And that means at least 80% of the voting and non-voting classes of stock of the target for the acquirer. And that may sound pretty simple, right? You either give up the stock or you don't. But oftentimes that can be a little bit of an unknown. And that might force us into a forward merger sometimes, because let's say that there's a shareholder loan from shareholder to target. Well, I don't know. Is that another class of stock for tax purposes? Enough people worry about that, that will sometimes cause us to think twice about doing the triangular reverse subsidiary. And then secondly, the target has to hold substantially all the assets of the target after the transaction. What that means is that the target, your company, can't be spinning off assets right before the merger. We can't be making big distributions. We can't be getting rid of unwanted assets, except to the extent it would not affect the substantially all test, which is pretty much a facts and circumstances test. So the other alternative to that, of course, is the forward triangular merger. And that one's really interesting in that it doesn't have to be an 80% of all voting and non-voting stock, right? It just has to be what would have been a good type A merger. So it's a much lower threshold for what we call continuity of interest. And we don't have to worry so much about shareholder loans. The downside to doing the forward triangular merger, however, is that number one, the merger subsurvives, not the target. So that means that employees and contracts, et cetera, are going to move into a new entity. And that can create some problems sometimes, or just some, not problems, but just some additional administrative hassle. The bigger downside is that if for some reason we mess this up and this forward triangular merger, which is a non-taxable transaction, becomes taxable, maybe because we didn't have sufficient continuity, we had too much cash in the deal, we didn't get at least 40% of the deal for stock. Whatever it is, if it messes it up, it's a tax disaster. Because remember what I said, whereas a reverse subsidiary merger looks a lot like a sale of stock, this is like a sale of assets. And if you have a taxable sale of stock, you have one level of tax, if any, by the way, on the sale of stock, and that's at the shareholder level. And if it's QSBS, maybe not. But with a sale of assets, if you have a taxable sale of assets, you've got two levels of tax, potentially. You've got one at the company level, then again at the shareholder level when the company is deemed to liquidate and distribute up the acquirer stock. And again, I'm not taking into account the effects of QSBS here. But you can see that it's way harder to fail this forward triangular merger test, but the consequences are more severe if you do. And because of that, sometimes you'll see what we call a double merger. I don't have a slide for it because this is getting into a little bit more sophisticated transaction planning where we do both a reverse and a forward, because the IRS says we're going to test that under the easy forward triangular merger test of would it have been a good type A? And if you fail it, we're going to tax you under the much more favorable reverse triangular merger test. But I honestly, I've only done a few of those. I mean, usually we get enough comfort that what we're doing is going to result in the intended tax consequences that we just go ahead and stick with the reverse triangular merger and accept the fact that it's going to be somewhat like a sale of stock. Now, that can be really interesting as not only as a matter of corporate succession, but also as a matter of corporate contracts. Because remember what I said with the reverse forward, you've got a new entity that's stepping into the stepping into the shoes of the target. Well, that might mean you have to go get a consent from somebody that you have a contract with. Whereas if it's only the ownership of the target that's changing, you might not have to get that consent. Depends on what the contracts say, but that's another one of the big reasons we like the reverse. So that's it in a nutshell at a high level. And this is Roger Royce of 10,000 Startups Podcast. The reverse triangular merger, like I say, in a nutshell. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next week.